Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Europe's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about risk management oversight. Can audit committees stay ahead of the curve? And joining me is Tim Copnell, who's the chairman of KPMG's UK Audit Committee Institute. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, TK. Good to be here.
Tough topic. One of the main duties. And I wanted to ask you about the current landscape with respect to audit committee, charter responsibility, and the board's key duty of overseeing risk management, which has gotten quite expansive these days, particularly with the addition of all the cyber risk threats and now the complexity of ESG. So talk to me and our audience about the current landscape.
It's a great question, TK. I guess here in the UK, the oversight of risk and of control primarily still rests with the audit committee. Yes, we do have risk committees in the financial services sector, but it's still really with the audit committee, or what we're increasingly calling them audit and risk committees. But I guess the thing I mentioned is these days, and you alluded to it, audit committees are so busy that the traditional audit committee responsibilities have been ramped up. The working environment is more complex than ever. We've got international financial reporting standards here in the UK and in Europe, which are increasingly complex and I guess sometimes counterintuitive. And we've got, certainly in the UK and Europe, much greater expectations placed on audit committees when it comes to the oversight of auditor appointment and the audit relationship itself. And then on top of that, to your point, many of these committees have now got cyber risk, they've got ESG risk, they've got compliance risks and a whole host of other things parachuted onto that traditional audit committee package, some of which sit easily with the audit committee, things around controls, around data, around reporting. But some of those risks are quite different from traditional audit committee responsibilities. And I guess when I talk to boards and I talk to audit committees, there's certainly a lot of consciousness around the audit committee being potentially overburdened. And there are three options, I guess, broadly that committees and boards more broadly are thinking about. First, the audit committee or the audit and risk committee can work harder. You can have more meetings, you can have longer meetings, but that isn't necessarily the answer. And it's certainly not the whole answer. You get the audit committee to work better, to work more efficiently, to think about the quality of the papers it receives, to think about the interactions it has elsewhere within the business, to think about the balance of time between being in listening mode and in debating mode. And certainly there are often efficiencies that can help. But I think most boards and audit and risk committees are going through this process at the moment where they're thinking about the governance structures themselves. So do some of these risks, cyber you mentioned, ESG risk or ESG risks, a whole package of risk there, should they be pushed back to the board? It's an attractive solution. I think most people would argue that cyber risk does reside with the board, but the whole point of committees is to try and reduce the work, the burden that the board has to go through itself. So that of itself is not necessarily the answer, pushing everything away from the audit committee back to the board. So then you start thinking about, and it's certainly very popular here in the UK, what I would call single issue risk committees. Are there some of these risks, cyber, ESG, climate change, sustainability, that you can just put into a committee all on its own? So not a risk committee itself that you would have, say, in the financial service sector that would have the whole remit of risk management under its wing, but just a small component of that risk management. I think some 20-25% of the FTSE 100 at this moment in time have some form of ESG committee. It might be called a sustainability committee or corporate responsibility committee or something like that. But these single issue risk committees are certainly more popular. But just a couple of thoughts on those, TK. They don't work really well if you've got a small board. If you've only got a handful of directors, you're going to end up with the same people with the same skill sets, doing the same oversight work, albeit in a different room with a different name on the door, ESG committee versus audit committee. So that's clearly not the solution for smaller boards. Larger boards, yes, that can work. You can spread the work, the risk oversight work across more people by creating these different committees. Again, not of itself the answer. A few worries that a lot of audit committees and certainly audit committee chairs I speak to think about. There's always going to be some overlap there. So take something like climate change. Yes, you might push that to an ESG committee. That seems like a natural thing to do. But what about the data systems, the controls, the reporting aspects? Does that go over there to the climate change committee, ESG committee, or does that stay with an audit committee? There are elements that feel more like the traditional audit committee role. And then the incentives for the right climate change behaviours. Is that an ESG committee thing, or is that a compensation or remuneration committee thing? So you're almost always going to end up with some oversight when you go down this new route of single issue risk committees. But I guess, TK, and I'll just finish this part of the session on this, overlap's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not efficient. But if you get gaps between where the oversight is sitting, that's where people really need to worry.
Historically, when we look back, 10, 15 years ago, when the stock exchanges sort of set up the rules, and it was sort of easy in the rules to say that the audit committee would be in charge of risk. Okay. Well, again, not only do they have typically that in their charter, but typically everything that pops up that people don't know where to put it they get extra confidence if they put it in the audit committee, and subsequently all of a sudden you have what's called audit creep, where agendas get so full that it becomes difficult to manage. So I sort of hear what you're saying here, and our challenge today is we don't have a ton of time, so we're trying to look at solving this challenge from 30,000 feet. I've never liked the idea of pushing. I mean, in my definition, the board has responsibility for everything, the full board. And if you push something back to them, that means that somebody isn't directly responsible for it. And that's why I think companies have done so well, is because board chairs, whether it's audit, compensation, nom-gov, something new, a risk committee, a sustainability committee, whatever it is, that chair of the committee takes on tremendous responsibility. And the board is still responsible, but they do the work between the meetings, they do the work at the committee meetings. So I'm a huge proponent for getting the right committees, but more importantly, even than that, the right chairs to head those committees. That gives me assurance that the work will be done. So I'm going to throw it back to you. So when we look at this challenge, I mean, and this is a challenge, I don't know, you talk about structure, in the sense of a charter or, some understanding. We have to add to this too, that every company is different. Okay. There's not one size that fits all. So you may have different skill sets. You may have, different, people. One board is large, one is small. So I think the solution is always going to be different, but there's got to be some fundamental things here on staying ahead of this curve. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. So if you had to say, what are those fundamental things that could keep a audit committee ahead of this curve on risk oversight, what advice would you give?
Another great question, TK. I'm going to break it down into some building blocks. I think that's what you're asking for here, the fundamentals. So let's break it down into, I don't know, I'll probably change my mind as I talk, but 5 or 6 different building blocks. I will start with competence. And you've already touched upon that when you talk about being a fan of committees and committee chairs who really take ownership of some of these risks on behalf of the board and make sure that the committee does the hard yards or the long yards. So I think the oversight of risk starts with a risk competent board. And by that, I don't mean every board member needs to have deep dive skills in every significant risk the organization's facing. But what I do mean is that the board itself needs to be thinking long and hard about whether across the board, across the audit committee, across any other committees that are taking on risk oversight responsibility, there are individuals with the right knowledge, the right skills, and the right experience to take on that role. And I think that's something that all boards should be looking at as part of their annual year-end board evaluation exercise. I think that's got to be building block number one, the skills and experience, getting those right audit committee chairs, risk committee chairs, whatever they happen to be, in place. I think the second building block is around the clarity and accountability piece. And to some extent, we've already touched upon that in terms of what the various structures should be like. Key there, I think, is clarity. I guess that however you're apportioning risk oversight across the board and the various different committees, everybody knows what they're doing. They don't only know what their committee is responsible for, but what the other committees are responsible for, thereby ensuring you're not having these gaps and any overlaps are reduced to a minimum. So I think that's the second building block I would talk about. The third one, I think, has to be culture. Risk management systems, internal control systems, they're all about people, really. Even those automated systems have people sat behind the automation. So I think getting the right risk culture in the business is absolutely critical. And I think the board's role there has to go beyond just setting the culture and values for the organization. It has to be around ensuring that that culture is communicated by management throughout the organization. It has to be around ensuring that there are the right core mechanisms in place, the hiring, the reward, the promotion mechanisms to promote a good risk culture within the organization, and of course the right sanctions for poor behaviors. And then you've got to have this whole thing embedded within the organization as a whole. So everybody's taking their responsibility for risk and control seriously and acting in a values orientated way. So that's the first three building blocks. I think on top of that, I then start looking at how risk and strategy piece together and whether the right conversations are happening in the right place. Now, to my mind, TK, I think of risk and strategy and risk. They're just two sides of the same coin. You can't have a discussion around the organization strategy without thinking about the risks that threaten the achievement of that strategy. I think that goes without saying. Everything the organization does carries risk, and therefore the question that should be constantly asked, in my view, throughout the year is, are those risks that the organization is willing to take? Also worth questioning, I guess, is it sufficient to have a strategy? I know we're talking about risk here, but is it sufficient to have a strategy day just once a year? And that's a traditional model. Let's all take ourselves away for a day and talk about strategy. Well, strategy and risk are the same things. Risk and strategy, to my mind, need talking about much more frequently. Maybe even every board meeting, certainly every audit committee meeting, you would expect risk, some aspects of risk to be very high on the agenda. So some things to think about here would be things like, the cyber issue mentioned earlier, some of those ESG risks, are they fully integrated into the board's business as usual processes and the board strategic thinking, or are they bolt-on things like we've seen perhaps with some organizations in recent years? There's the strategy. Now we're just going to think about some ESG issues on the side. I think ESG, cyber, they're so fundamental to corporate success and value creation these days. They have to be a fundamental part of that conversation. Also think about, those risks coming over the horizon. Are the risk management systems adequate to address the speed and impact of those mega trends and those potential disruptions coming over the horizon? And think about, what will the business look like in 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time? And can the board explain what would happen if if the organization wasn't here in 2, 5 or 10 years time? Really, really big questions within that risk and strategic thinking piece. The fifth building block here, TK, I think is around information and the flow of information. That's the lifeblood of board oversight in many ways. The board should be specifying the nature, the source, the format, the frequency of the information it requires, and ensuring that's of sufficient quality to enable the board or those oversight committees to carry out effective oversight. The sixth building block is all around assurance. What assurance does the board or those committees need to ensure that the risk management system, the internal controls are working as effective? Here, they need to think about mapping the strategy to the risks to the controls, and the controls to the assurance that it requires. And if that all maps perfectly, that's a good place to be. But if there are gaps there, then that's something for the board to worry about. Also think about gross risk and net risk here, because when thinking about those two differences, the piece in between it is effectively the control. And the wider the gap between the gross risk and net risk, the more important the control is, and therefore an area where the board might want to have more assurance in place. And I guess finally, it's just bringing that whole piece together. It's the board, the board's role is an oversight role. It's management that are responsible for putting the systems in place to assess the risk, to identify the risk, to assess the risk, and then to manage and mitigate that risk. But there are still a couple of key questions I'd expect boards to be thinking about. Had the actions been taken to promptly remedy any significant failings or weaknesses? And do any failings or weaknesses suggest poor decision making, or the need for a more extensive monitoring or a reassessment of the whole effectiveness of the management's ongoing processes? So just to finish off, TK, I think the last point I would make is that boards should have a weather eye on the willingness of the organisation to take risk. Executives are immersed in the running of the business, that's what they should be doing, but the board are bringing a wider window on the world and may often be more open to taking on more risk and opportunity than the executive team. I think it was Mark Zuckerberg who famously said, the biggest risk of all is not taking any risk. And in a world that's changing so quickly, I think he might have hit the nail on the head with that.
Well, risk is not a negative 4-letter word. I would agree with you. Risk management, though, is a global audit committee challenge. And Tim, I want to thank you for taking the time, and particularly in the giving us some building blocks to think about what's happening. Obviously, we could talk about this for hours, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us and take an introspective look at this challenge of risk management for corporate boards. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, TK.
And that will conclude this session of Inside Europe's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again soon with another episode to help you be a better board member or committee member. So thanks for joining us.